Ladies and gentlemen, I shall now invite Dr. Pierre Kory to give his lecture. Stay tuned. This is promising to be very exciting, very inspirational. Over to you, Dr. Pierre Kory.
Well, thank you. It's an honor again to be able to share the knowledge that we've gained in the FLCCC. Let me just see if I can. Is that fill the screen? Does that look okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about, the question that came from the media. I'm going to get to that answer of what I think the solution would look like. But first, let me go through how we got there. And so I just wanted to share with the main physician members of the FLCCC Alliance. And please know, it's not just the physicians. If it was just the physicians, I don't even know that we'd have a website right now or much of an organization. There's a lot of people behind the scenes who support us, guide us, and really motivate us. And so, but these are the physicians that came together, and we've collected a number as we've gone along. What briefly, I just want to talk about, and this is not an ego exercise, but I just want to point out that the work that we've done, the papers that we've read, the doctors that we've talked to, based on our experience, we've gotten a lot of things right. And we believe that we've done the work that the public agencies should have done. Their task forces have failed. We've tried to learn about every aspect of disease. We've looked at autopsy studies and animal studies and all clinical trials and all the therapeutics, and we learned some things pretty quickly. And we really wish that we could have had a seat at the table as a group of expert clinicians. I don't believe that the public health agencies are elevating the clinicians to the point that they should. And the one thing that we knew from very early on is you don't put a person on a mechanical ventilator before they absolutely need it. Early intubation is harmful and should be avoided. And we did that from early on when I was a chief at the University of Wisconsin. We learned that corticosteroids were critical in COVID-19 lung disease. And I testified in the Senate back in May at a time when every national and international healthcare agency was against it. We also know that longer duration and titratable corticosteroids is required. You can't just give 10 days when patients are sick for 20, and premature discontinuation is harming people. And the low doses is also harming people. We learned very early on that anticoagulation, and keep in mind, all of these things that we learned months before they became standard of care. And you know why? Is because everybody is waiting for large randomized controlled trials, and they're forgetting how to doctor, which is you make a determination based on pathophysiology, knowledge of therapeutics, and a risk-benefit analysis. We also recognized that airborne transmission was occurring and that you absolutely needed to protect yourself, and the importance of masks in many situations. And then our combination therapy protocols are critical to this disease. As Professor Mayer points out, this is one of the wickedly and most complex pathophysiologic diseases we have ever encountered in our careers. And a combination therapy is key. And all of our components that we've put on many months ago are continuously validated as we go along. And then I should add, obviously, ivermectin is only the latest in our identifications and discoveries. And so Dr. Maduri published this in April of last year. He's one of our FLCCC members, and he wrote the first paper arguing for the need for corticosteroids. I gave testimony in May 7th of last year, again, at a time when the entire world was against us with corticosteroids. So please, if you understand our advocacy for ivermectin, this is not the first time that we've identified a critically important therapeutic, and we've tried to share that knowledge. And it was only 7 weeks later after that testimony that the world adopted the use of corticosteroids overnight. And when did they do it? When a large, heavily funded, randomized controlled trial told them to do it. And I have to tell you again, you can learn things without such trials. And there was many people in the placebo arm in this trial who did not do well, and there were many lives that were lost. But ultimately, it was this trial that changed the standard of care. This is a paper I wrote that I started writing in late April, early May, because I understood that this was not a viral pneumonia, but it's an organized pneumonia, which is a different entity, and it requires corticosteroid. And this is probably my proudest achievement in COVID, was this paper that I wrote with one of the world's top chest radiologists. And we've also understood from the beginning, you needed not dexamethasone, you needed methylprednisolone and higher doses. And if you look at this graph, number needed to treat to save one life, it's a measure of the potency of a therapy. And lower numbers are much more potent than higher numbers, because for every 2.7 people you treat with this dose of methylprednisolone, you will save one life. And if you look at these low doses of dexamethasone, you would need 20 to 30 patients treated to save one life, where here you have single digits when you use methylprednisolone. The world needs to stop using dexamethasone as 6 milligrams. We are losing patients worldwide with these anemic doses of methylprednisolone. And we even have studies comparing them head to head. And guess what? For every 5 patients you treat with a higher dose of methylprednisolone, you will save a life compared to dexamethasone. The data is overwhelming, and yet public health agencies across the world are still recommending dexamethasone 6 milligrams. The other thing is anticoagulation. We started recommending that after our first 5 patients. We said these patients need to have their blood thinned. They're all clotting to rates we'd never seen before in our life. But I got attacked. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I left my old institution, is because they would not let me doctor. They would not let me use steroids, and they would not let me advocate for blood thinners. And then again, it became the standard of care. And a lot of my struggles were profiled in this New York Times magazine, where, I kid you not, the top supposedly top medical journal of the world, the editor called me, and I would say our group, lucky that we got lucky. How many times do we have to get lucky before they start listening to us? The other thing is airborne transmission. We could tell there were super spreader events all around the world. We knew this was airborne. I wrote an op-ed that was accepted by the New York Times. Unfortunately, it never got published because the op-ed board got fired because of an unfortunate op-ed that they published, and there was a revolt at the New York Times. I later went on to publish it in a major U.S. newspaper, in USA Today, where I gave all of the evidence that this was airborne, and that everyone needed in medicine to wear N95s, and that masks were needed in confined, small dimensioned places. And I have to tell you, even a year later, March 31st, scientists are complaining. The WHO, this is just to show you, the public health agencies are failing. They are not recognizing the data. They're under political influences, and they're reluctant to act on the science as it is. And still, a year later, the WHO still does not recognize that this is airborne transmission. It is beyond absurd. And then this is just a small sample of the many papers that us as individuals and as a group have published during the pandemic, and it continues. We are still publishing, and we are still learning about this disease. And this is our Math Plus protocol, and this is our first one. We've added to it since. It's constantly evolving as the data comes out. And so, and that was our first one. And at first we came to recognition, and I'll tell you, we haven't changed most of the earliest components. We've added to it, but there's very little we've changed except for some modifications to dosing. And I will tell you, one of the greatest successes that we've learned recently, Professor Marek gave a very celebrated lecture to the country of Ukraine with thousands of physicians. And we learned there that the Math Plus protocol is the standard protocol across the country in Ukraine. And they have the lowest rates of mortality compared to all of Eastern and Western Europe. And so then I'll come to the ivermectin story. And so I just want you guys to know the amount of work that we've done, the comprehensive look, and the deep dives we've done in every aspect of this disease. Like I mentioned in my acceptance speech, you know, it was Professor Marek who first identified the data signal. And he started to say, he actually gave a lecture, just for context. He gave a lecture in middle of October, where he talked about ivermectin being the solution to the pandemic, middle of October. I'm here tonight giving a very similar lecture with a lot more data, but he knew it then, and boy, do we know it now. And so when he first started talking about it, a lot of us thought he was you know, a little bit overstating the case for ivermectin. And I got curious, and I fell in behind him, as I usually do, and I started to read. And what I kept discovering was just more and more and more data. And I was again invited to the Senate, and I came out again saying it is absolutely critical that ivermectin be systematically and globally deployed. And no one, and still, these are recent recommendations, they are still recommending to not use outside of clinical trials. It is absurd, and I will explain to you why that is absurd. But that Senate testimony, and I think my anger and exhaustion and just, I could tell the public health agencies were failing, and I was given an opportunity to call them out for that, and I took that opportunity. And luckily now ivermectin is more and more well known, and I'm grateful that that happened, because it was critical that we learn for another tool, and it's even more critical now. And so for anyone out there who doesn't know what ivermectin is, and it's already been talked about. Tansreed Lee talked about it, and it was also in the opening video. But it's a famous drug that had a major impact on the public health status in eradicating parasitic diseases, and it's won the Nobel Prize. It's on the WHO's list of essential medicines. But here's the thing: for 10 years now, 10 years. They have been doing studies in the lab, and they're showing that ivermectin actually inhibits many viruses. It's not just COVID. It's not a new finding to say that it's effective against viruses. There are studies on Zika and dengue and West Nile and influenza and even HIV. And then a study came out showing that it was effective in the lab against SARS-CoV-2. And there's numerous mechanisms. And if you were going to design a drug for a disease like COVID, which begins as a viral syndrome, and then in many patients turns into this hyperinflammatory lung damage, you would want something that is antiviral and anti-inflammatory. And you have that in spades in ivermectin. It has multiple antiviral mechanisms and multiple anti-inflammatory mechanisms. And we started to compile all of that evidence. I was shocked to learn that there was 10 years of antiviral data. In vitro data, and then there was starting to become animal data, and then there was computational data showing that it bound very tightly to the spike protein, and we detailed this in our review article. And I don't want to go over the sad chapter of having passed peer review at a major journal, and while waiting for it to be published, because it passed peer review by 3 senior scientists. Some of you who is listening to the lecture may know about what happened, but we noticed that there was a delay to publication. And suddenly I asked my this issue editor to please find out what the delays were, because people were dying. And we were informed that they were retracting the paper because they didn't believe our conclusions were supported by the evidence. I have never given so much positive evidence in support of a medicine, and it got retracted. And that is another example of the sinister forces at work against inconvenient science to their aims. But luckily, we found another journal who looked at the peer review of the senior scientists and thought it was absolutely superb, and that our conclusions were well supported, and we got it published. But we are not alone. Tess Laurie's group, veteran researchers, some of the most highly regarded, highly published researchers in the field, decades of experience working for the WHO, the Cochrane Library, the NHS. They did their own meta-analysis, and they joined forces with us, and they also published even more data showing tremendous reduction in death based on numerous randomized controlled trials. And they also found, by looking at all the data and doing all the due diligence, that it was moderate certainty evidence. If you're listening to this, please understand that it is very rare for a guideline to have high level certainty evidence. Most guidelines are either low or moderate. And keep in mind, corticosteroids, which are the standard of care across the world, sits upon moderate certainty evidence. This is the time to deploy. The evidence is there. Numerous expert panels are showing it. The most recent is Dr. Andrew Hill, who was working for the WHO and Unitate. His contract ended, and after he left the WHO, just 2 weeks ago, he published his meta-analysis, which has even more data than Tess Laurie's group did. It's on 24 randomized controlled trials. Again, one of the world's top researchers published a paper, 24 randomized controlled trials, massive reductions in mortality, time to clinical recovery, and time to viral clearance. And guess what? It appears on no major newspaper in the world. We have serious problems right now where the science, which is apparently viewed as inconvenient to the monolithic vaccination policy, is being suppressed. This should be front page news of every newspaper in the world, and it is not. Open Forum Infectious Diseases is a very prominent journal, and it's one of the Infectious Disease Society of American journals. And they also found that the quality of studies was actually reasonable. There was only a small proportion that were at high risk of bias. And when you remove those low quality studies, you did not change what they found, which is conclusions of the most important impacts of the most important outcomes. And then I just have to say to the audience, the efficacy is proven. You have Hill et al., you have Lurie et al., you have our group. We're some of the most highly published intensivists in the world. And then you even have Satoshi Omura. His review calls for the immediate adoption from his institute in Japan, another group from Spain and Italy. We need to stop these trials. No more trials are needed. You can do trials on dose, on duration, but no more placebo. You can't give placebo in an ethical manner anymore when you sit on top of this evidence base. Now, I'll show you how absurd it is. Anyone who complains that more evidence is needed, first of all, does not recognize some of the founding principles of evidence-based medicine, which is at the top. The strongest level of evidence is actually a meta-analysis of randomized trials. Meta-analysis of randomized trials. But here's the other kicker, is that observational controlled trials actually have been shown to have the same estimate of benefit or harm as randomized. They reached the same conclusion. This has been published in numerous reviews looking at the history of observational and randomized. You should not discount observational studies. And when you look at the body of evidence of the randomized and observational, it is overwhelming. 60 controlled trials, 30 of them are now randomized. Massive, consistent, precise improvements in prevention, early treatment, late treatment, lives saved. I have never seen an evidence base this large and this profoundly ignored. It is absolutely unacceptable. 21,000 patients in these trials. I cannot imagine the feat that they're pulling off, which is their ability to ignore this evidence is literally, it would be unbelievable if it wasn't describing my life and my everyday existence right now. But this is absolutely unheard of. I want to show the audience, this is what's called a forest plot. And when you do meta-analyses, what you do is you put the point estimates. So this is the point of no effect. So if you have no effect, this is where you find that when you treat one group or another, there's really no difference. So this is the no difference line. If the control groups are favored, you see that there's actually harm. So if you've given ivermectin, you do worse if the point estimates are here. I'm going to show you a series of these forest plots. Look at the consistency and reproducibility of the prevention trials. Notice that every one is statistically significant, which is to say that their confidence intervals do not cross 1. Over and over and over. And like Tansri Lee talked about, if you take it, and I'd like to qualify, if you take it regularly, you will not get sick. And generally we're finding that you need to take it weekly. The ones where you take it every month, you do run a small risk of getting sick, but overall you're far, far, far better protected if you take it regularly. If you look at the late treatment trials, never mind the early treatment, and I actually skipped the slide, which was early treatment, which actually had a 67% improvement in those important outcomes. But late treatment, again, you see this remarkable consistency. Yes, there's an occasional trial where you might see, especially if it's small, this is a tiny trial, so it's probably not measuring a precise point estimate. But if you look at mortality, look at the consistent reproducible benefits of mortality. And some are small trials, but that's what meta-analyses are for, is that you sum them together. And look at the difference between early and late. You want to treat early. If you look at impacts on hospitalization, especially if you treat early, you can get people away from the hospital. And I'm going to show you even more real world data on that. Same thing with late treatment, less effect, but still positive. And then people talk about, oh, they're not peer reviewed. We can't trust this data because it's not peer reviewed. Guess what? 39 ivermectin peer reviewed trials. Look, it's the same, whether it's peer reviewed or not. It's consistent and uniformly and profoundly positive, with early favoring treatment over late. And so I've never seen meta-analysis or forest plots. Now, to truly understand the absurdity of non-adoption of ivermectin, let us look at the history of the Infectious Disease Society of America, their guidelines in numerous infectious disease. In that paper, they actually reviewed the history of guidelines. And in 44 treatment guidelines for various diseases, 50% had no controlled trial data, and it was based on expert opinion only. A further 31% did not have even one randomized controlled trial, and only 16% had at least one randomized study. And so for the IDSA to currently not recommend ivermectin is absurd. There's more evidence in the ivermectin database than any prior disease model that they have ever made a guideline on. And currently they say more trials are needed. And keep in mind that the most common quality of evidence was low in all of these trials, and most of it was level 3. Let's go back to Dr. Hill's meta-analysis. Knowing this data, knowing that most of the evidence and guidelines in treatment are based on very few randomized studies, let's go back to Dr. Hill's 24 randomized controlled trials, 3,328 patients. He did not look at observational trials. He just looked at randomized. And again, the quality is there. And so another absurdity, look at how the WHO approved ivermectin for the treatment of scabies and strong litiasis. In scabies, 10 randomized controlled trials, 852 patients, and it wasn't even superior to the standard of care, which was permethrin cream. It was adopted because it's much easier to administer. It did not even hit the level of superiority, yet it was adopted worldwide based on this evidence base. In strong litiasis, it was adopted worldwide based on this evidence base. Can somebody see that there's something wrong here? That there's a glaring and inexcusable inconsistency in how we are arriving at recommending this medicine during a global pandemic where thousands and thousands and millions now have died? And again, just to look at an absurdity, again, the harm of ivermectin over the decades of use, maybe one death is associated a year, whereas in COVID, we're talking about you could save 500,000 lives per year, and yet CDC still does not recommend. It is inexplicable. And so contrast that also with remdesivir. Right, an article went over remdesivir. In the United States, every patient admitted to a hospital is given remdesivir at $3,000 a dose, and it doesn't work. The WHO doesn't even recommend, even the WHO doesn't recommend remdesivir, but our country, it's approved and it's given widely, even though it was based on small trials with about 1,000 people in it. Someone needs to explain to me what this inconsistency is all about. And then keep in mind, Dr. Andrew Hill, before the WHO told him to stop speaking publicly, he was literally told to stop speaking publicly. He was no longer allowed to give public lectures. He was no longer allowed to share with the FLCCC his data. And so he essentially obeyed them. In a pandemic, he obeyed them. But before he did this, he was giving lectures and he was saying, the purpose of this report is to forewarn people that this is coming. Get prepared, get supplies, get ready. We need to be ready. The probability that the measured impacts on survival of ivermectin is due to chance is 1 in 5,000. And that was back in February when he only had 18 randomized controlled trials in 2,200 patients. Now I'm sure it's far, far lower than that. And then he also reminds us that millions of vaccine doses were manufactured and purchased even before we knew they worked. Why can't we do that with ivermectin? And now let's just switch to the, how much time do I have? I've probably been going 30, 35 minutes. I should wrap up in 5, 10.
You're still okay. 5 to 10 is fine.
Great. So let's just go through some real world evidence, because that's also very important. Observational, randomized, in vitro, in vivo, animal. And let's just finish this out. Let's look at the real world evidence. So it was recognized as far ago as the spring that when people started to look at Africa, they noticed that in the countries that had regular parasite eradication programs, which is widespread distribution of ivermectin to prevent parasite infestations, they noticed that the deaths and the case counts of COVID was much, much less. And if you look down here, look at the difference in mortality amongst the countries with ivermectin mass distribution, which is given at most twice a year. It's literally almost a tenth of the deaths that you see in the non-ivermectin country. If you look at the morbidity, the amount of cases, it is again almost a tenth of what the other countries do. This was noticed very early. Multiple papers have been published on this incredible discrepancy between ivermectin countries and not. And that's just one example. Zimbabwe, during their spike, they adopted it on a certain day at a peak while it was rising. And immediately after using it throughout the population, you saw this temporally associated rapid decrease in Zimbabwe. Mexico City actually did it formally. They conducted a test and treat program and they collected the data. And what I'm going to show you is that in December, at the height of their hospitals were filling, they were running out of oxygen, and they started a mass test and treat in Mexico City. And this is their data. I'm not going to go through the conduct of the trial, but just know many thousands of patients were in this that got the kit and those that didn't get the kit. You had over 100,000 patients. They were matched in severity very tightly. The proportion that had severe and moderate were very, very closely matched. And this was in 100,000 patients. What did they find? That before they started using ivermectin, they noticed that hospitalizations rapidly decreased almost 70%. And if they looked at comparing the two groups, almost 76% less hospitalizations. And no matter how they looked at it, they saw somewhere around 70 to 80% less hospitalization. And they started to talk about this in the papers, but then this became controversial. People said the data was contrived, and the opposition to ivermectin still reigns, and it's still somehow unproven. Why is it unproven? Look at the deaths that happened after the test and treat program. It rapidly plummeted. This is evidence of Google mobility data. The mobility was increasing during this time, and yet case counts, deaths, and hospitalizations were rapidly decreasing after ivermectin was systematically deployed. And they got to the point that the excess death rate in society approached that of pre-pandemic. And this was a time, these rapid reductions, a time when they had at most 5% vaccinated. It was not the vaccines. And then you could see this was, I think, in April or May. This is the occupancy of the hospitals. 20 to 30% occupancy. The hospitals were empty. The only places where you saw high occupancy was where they had few beds. And so they opened up their country, and now more reports are coming out. Just a few weeks ago, Misiones, a state in Argentina, did a program where they showed if you treated them with ivermectin, very few went to the hospital and very few died. Huge reductions in the rates of hospitalization and death. Another state in Argentina, a similar program, much lower chance of ICU admission, much lower chance of dying. Peru has been through a roller coaster, a literal roller coaster. They did an ivermectin distribution program. They solved the pandemic. A new administration came on who didn't believe in ivermectin, and they stopped the distribution program. They again went out of control, and now it's repackaged, and they're doing it again, and now they're actually seeing success again. So you can see the impacts of public policy on these. Even in the US, we have data showing massive increases after the testimony and after our press conference, showing huge increases in ivermectin distribution. And this rapid reduction here occurred while only 4% were vaccinated. And so we do believe that ivermectin played a role even in the US. And if you're worried about the variants, all we have is data showing that First of all, many of the variants, some of the vaccines are not doing well. Even people vaccinated need treatment. A poor patient who is vaccinated who still gets ill will need treatment. That's why we consider this a sister intervention. And keep in mind, ivermectin, we do not have any evidence that it doesn't work against the variants. There are too many mechanisms upon which it works that the virus could not evade all of these. The vaccines only have one mechanism. And I'll tell you that we have data showing, particularly in India, in the states which aggressively used it, you saw these rapid reductions. Whereas at the time in Tamil Nadu, where they made it illegal, you saw this rapid increase. They did start to adopt a naturopathic medicine, which is antiviral, which apparently still works quite well because they did solve it, but much later and after those who had adopted ivermectin. And if you look at India as a whole, you saw that within a week or two of a mass adoption across India, you saw the peak and then the rapid fall. And 91% were the Delta variant. Uttarakhand actually distributed it to all their residents. I have never seen such a rapid drop, literally within a week from this peak down to almost none. And they've literally solved COVID in that state of Uttarakhand. And this shows just the massive decreases in states that adopted and the massive increases that those that didn't in India. And then in Uttar Pradesh, now you have to keep in mind, Uttar Pradesh has been using ivermectin widely in treatment across the state since August. So then you might ask yourself, why did this happen? Well, what happened is when India was overwhelmed with the epidemic of the Delta variant, there are millions of migrant workers in Mumbai who live in Uttar Pradesh, and they all rushed home to escape the lockdown in Mumbai. And when they arrived, they were all infected, and they caused a massive increase in cases. But in Uttar Pradesh, they went to train stations and bus stations, and they did testing and treating, and they were able to beat back this onslaught of infections. And now there are almost no deaths occurring in Uttar Pradesh. And same thing in South Africa, the Beta variant, we know that ivermectin worked well in. And we also know the Gamma variant in Brazil with a P1 variant. We also saw that in Manaus that was overwhelmed. And after the Ministry of Health determined that ivermectin must be used, they again beat back that variant. So the variants are not a problem. And we believe that that we should also follow Bulgaria's lead, is that ivermectin should be made available without a prescription. Let people protect themselves. Many countries across the world, notice Western Europe and North America is still gray. And we have hope for Malaysia and Indonesia and Philippines with the increased interest and the supportive groups that are present tonight. Hopefully we can turn this the dark green that it should be, and we can beat back the pandemic in Asia. And so just keep in mind, my advice to you, and this is where I'll finish, is that a virus that cannot replicate cannot mutate. So if you can prevent the onset of disease and you can eradicate the disease and transmission, you are going to avoid these strains from developing, and you're not going to get these escape strains. And keep in mind, it is one of the safest medicines known in history. It only has mild transient effects in a rarity of patients, and there's almost never a severe effect. It does not cause liver failure. There's only 2 to 3 cases of hepatitis in the literature over decades and billions of doses. And even though it's not recommended in pregnancy, there's lots of data to show that it can be used safely in pregnancy. So again, pregnancy is a difficult one because we can never truly recommend something, but we do have plenty of clinical data showing that it works. And so again, one of the safest drugs and one of the cheapest drugs. Literally, it's a WHO essential medicine. It's given across some of the lowest and poorest countries across the world. It's 3 US cents per 12 milligram tablet. There are many manufacturers worldwide. You don't need a refrigerator, and there's no administration cost. It's a pill that you can swallow. And I'll end here. These are our protocols. They're on flccc.net. We have prevention and early outpatient treatment. So if you're at high risk and your prognosis or outcome would be really bad if you got COVID and you're not vaccinated, we recommend that you take a dose every week. Take 2 low doses, then take it every week. If someone in your household gets COVID, everyone in the household should be given ivermectin to prevent their contracting disease. Numbers of trials have shown that this is highly effective. And then in treatment, keep in mind, we do not want to stick on one dose. We are finding, especially with the Delta variant, in some areas, especially if you don't get to them early, you need higher doses. There is a dose-dependent effect. And so if you get to them early, probably 0.2 to 0.4 milligrams per kilogram is effective. But if you get them days into symptoms where they're a lot more ill and they're not doing well, you need to use higher doses. And in the sickest, I would use 0.6. And we also have, if they're not responding to ivermectin, we'll go to fluvoxamine, which is also being shown to be very helpful. And also nasopharyngeal sanitation. The virus resides in the nasal pharynx. And if you can decontaminate that and use these virucidal washes and sprays, there are huge benefits in outcomes, especially povidone iodine. And then we also have immune supplementation. We also have a pared down one for governments or health ministries to use that can just be simplified, which is just sort of one treatment dose for all. You try to treat the many instead of the individual. And so in more limited resources and in mass distributions where it's you can follow our IMASS protocol, which we've simplified. And then I just remind you again, our Math Plus for the hospital. And then most importantly, I finish with, and this is the beauty of this story, is not only is it prevents, it treats early, it even saves lives in the hospital, but you have to know that long haul COVID, patients who recover from the acute illness, many are debilitated and disabled. They are sick. They cannot function like they used to. Many of them are out of work. Many of them don't leave the house. But guess what? Ivermectin is doing incredibly well in long haul. And this is our iRecover protocol, again, centered around ivermectin, but it's also a combination and stepwise therapy. And I just want to finish with an anecdote saying that probably the most satisfying thing that is going on in my life is treating people with long haul. These people are so miserable. And you give them ivermectin, and some of them have been sick for months, 6 to 7 months. And within a dose or two of ivermectin, they feel like they got their lives back, and they literally will cry. I've never had so much satisfaction doing anything in my career as treating someone who has this robust response to ivermectin. And so I hope I didn't overstay or spend too much time on my lecture, but just keep in mind that unfortunately, it's independent groups of experts like the MAECC, like the FLCCC, who are on the right side of science and the right side of data. And unfortunately, I hope we can get these big agencies, which are unfortunately influenced by other political and policy and financial goals, but they need to start listening on the sake of humanity. And like it was mentioned earlier, I hope we're heading into the third stage of truth, because I'm really tired of being ridiculed, violently opposed, and censored. And I hope that tonight is the beginning of our approaching that third stage of truth. And so thank you. And I just hope that on behalf of Malaysia, that you can end the pandemic urgently in your country. Get the supplies, make sure it's available for early, late, and long haul treatment. Please, bold action. Not only can you save Asia, but you can be an example to the rest of the world. We need partners in this fight, and we need you to show that ivermectin truly is a solution. So thank you very much. And again, I'm so honored by the award and the beautiful gifts and the recognition of the FLCCC, and also the call to support us. We are up against a massive enemy. So every piece of support that you can is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pierre, Kory. That was a great, eye-opening, very informative, very educational, inspirational 40 plus minutes you gave. Thank you very much.